Hi everyone, welcome back. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with the features needed for identifying most types of consonants, we can now turn to vowels. So as I mentioned previously, vowels are essentially characterized by the same features as the dorsal consonants. The main features that we need are front, back, high, and low to identify the formation of most possible vowels. So when we have these two sets of binary distinctions, then we are able to easily create a three-way distinction between high, low, and mid vowels. So here we have the sounds which are plus high. We have sounds which are plus high and minus low. There are sounds that are minus high and minus low, and sounds which are minus high but plus low. It's not possible to have sounds that are both plus high and plus low. Those are two features that rule each other out. And the same applies to the features front and back, which creates a three-way distinction between front, back, and central vowels. And in the same way, it's impossible to have a combination of the features front and plus front and plus back. One further feature which is relevant for vowels is the feature tense, which we'll use to distinguish upper mid and lower mid vowels. So to make a small vowel chart here, let's imagine a language that has what could be called four different heights of articulation: a high vowel E, a higher mid vowel A, and a lower mid vowel E, and a low vowel A. We need some feature here to distinguish between these mid vowels, since these mid vowels are both going to be specified as non-high and non-low. Here the feature tense is used, and we will generally interpret the mid-high vowels as being tense and the mid-low vowels as non-tense. The mid-low vowels are also sometimes called lax vowels, whereas sensibly the mid-high vowels would be referred to as tense vowels. Also for vowels, since very often languages distinguish between long and short vowels, this is in the International Phonetic Alphabet, marked with a symbol which looks a bit like a set of 2 points, the colon, but is not. One further point about the feature tense is that this is a bit difficult to describe articulatorily. There are ongoing phonetic investigations into what tenseness here is. The description that I like to use, and which on my own, in terms of my own introspection, makes sense, is that the muscles of the tongue body tighten a little bit in the production of the vowels that we identify as tense, and this causes the tongue body to be raised slightly upward and thereby create vowels with the tongue position that are slightly higher. There are, though, other phonologists that consider the so-called tense vowels to be identical to vowels that have an advanced tongue root. And the feature advanced tongue root is clearly phonetically appropriate for describing vowel distinctions that acoustically are pretty similar among some languages of Africa and some of Indonesia. Make one short excursus on English and German here about the features tense and the feature long, because in these two languages, English and German, there's some appreciable degree of overlap between the features plus tense and plus long on vowels. In general, in these two languages, the vowels which are plus tense are also end up being longer, and vice versa. The standard phonemic analyses of these two languages differ in that typically most phonologists take the relevant phonemic distinction in English to be one of the feature tense, whereas very often in phonemic analyses of German, the relevant distinction is taken to be one of vowel length. So in effect, one could say that the tense vowels in English usually take on the value plus long, whereas the long vowels of German usually take on the feature plus tense. And we can see concretely in English how and why the feature tense is useful, because there is a phonotactic restriction in English which specifies that only tense vowels are allowed to occur at the end of a word. So for instance, a word like si is not allowed in English. So if you try to give a native speaker of English such a word, they will repair it by doing something like adding a glottal stop at the end to say something like sit instead, which would be well formed. Notice that in our system, in terms of frontness and backness, we use both the features front and back. Some feature systems try to use the feature back alone. So for instance, in Hall's textbook, as opposed to Hayes, the feature front is not present. But it does look like there are some languages that do have a sufficient number of phonemic contrasts in order to need both the features back and front. So Norwegian, for instance, has the following minimal pairs. So it distinguishes between front vowels. So the word by is plus front and plus. So this is a front vowel, a true front vowel. It's plus front and minus back. The central rounded vowel would be minus front and minus. Front rounded. And then finally, oo is minus front and plus back. So if we had the feature back alone, we could identify the vowel in under letter A as being minus back, but it would be difficult to distinguish between the vowels given in B and C. So let's now quickly summarize the interaction of the features that are relevant for most vowels in this table. So we have, for instance, the upper high vowels, which have the feature plus the upper high front vowels like E. And if we change the value in tense, then we end up with a vowel like I. We can also change the corresponding roundness to produce vowels like U and U. And if we move back by changing the feature front to minus front, then we obtain central high vowels. And finally, by adopting the feature back, we obtain back vowels. So we can see that almost everywhere there are contrasts in rounding. There are only a few sort of gaps in the standard vowel inventories of the world. There's a sort of gap in terms of lacks central high vowels, and the one typical lacks back high vowel is also rounded. You'll notice also that among low vowels, there is generally it's generally agreed that it's not possible to have a distinction in tenseness here. So all of the vowels that are low, a front low vowel like a central round vowel like a, and a back, a central low vowel like a and a back low vowel like a, these don't have corresponding tense and lax pairs. Okay, so the last major set of features with which we need to concern ourselves today are the features that refer to glottal state, namely what the glottis is doing. The feature voice ought to be very familiar to you. This simply refers to whether the vocal folds are vibrating. Then Hayes' system includes two other features. On the table, you'll see these glottal state features marked as laryngeal features. That means basically the same thing. And there are just the three features here: voice, spread glottis, and constricted glottis. Spread glottis says whether the vocal folds are set wide apart or whether they are pressed tightly together. So if we initially look at just the combinations of spread glottis and constricted glottis here in terms of types of different types of so-called phonation, typical ways in which sounds may be articulated in different laryngeal states, then we see aspirated sounds and so-called breathy voiced sounds, which occur in a lot of languages in India, as being sounds that are plus spread glottis and non-constricted glottis. And at the other end, we have ejectives, which occur, for instance, in languages of the Caucasus and a lot of indigenous languages of North America. Sounds like ah, ah, a glottal stop or creaky voice have the opposite values, minus spread glottis and constricted glottis. And sounds with normal phonation are neither plus spread glottis nor plus constricted glottis. But a potential issue here is that, of course, we might want to distinguish, for instance, between aspirated sounds and breathy voiced sounds. These privative binary features might be somewhat too categorical, perhaps for glottal states, which often look like they have sort of a spectrum between, how open the glottis is and how tightly pressed together the vocal folds are. If we go to sort of extremes, so for instance, aspirated stops versus ejective stops, those seem to fit the binary features of plus spread glottis and plus constricted glottis pretty well. And you'll notice that both of those have the value minus voice. So aspirated stops like ta, ejective stops like ah. When we come into other areas, the breathy voice stops, we can usually see those as being voiced, as does the creaky voiced phonation. And what's interesting about these phonation types is that these tend towards having an open glottis, and they're phonation types which have a tendency, namely, towards being more open or being more closed. But the feature voice here basically makes the complete openness of plus spread glottis or the complete closure of plus constricted glottis impossible. So namely, if the vocal folds are trying to vibrate while simultaneously being having an open state or having a closed state, then we achieve these sort of intermediate phonation types of creaky voice and breathy voice. So we could maybe revise these phonation types with the chart in 20, where we have the voiceless spread glottis aspiration, the voiced spread glottis sounds of breathy voiced, normal phonation, which neither has spread glottis nor constricted glottis, and which could be voiced or voiceless. So there, the vocal folds can vibrate as they will. And then it might have been better to invert creaky voice and ejectives here to show that creaky voice is, so ejectives achieve this perfect constricted glottis state, whereas creaky voiced sounds can't keep the vocal folds tightly together because they are voiced. Namely, they are trying to allow the vocal folds to vibrate. Before we conclude today, I'll briefly mention a couple of other features. The feature nasal is pretty self-explanatory, means that the velum is lowered, allowing air to pass through into the nasal cavity. The feature lateral, we see it here. Here's the feature lateral in the chart. It refers to L-like sounds. And what that feature means is that air can move along the sides of the tongue. So in Latin, lateral means precisely side. And it mostly refers to a set of approximants. I believe these are the only 6 sounds typical sounds represented as having the feature plus lateral. There are 4 approximants at the alveolar, palatal, retroflex, and dorsal places of articulation. And there are also 2 coronal fricatives and contrasting in voicing, which can be lateral. The feature trill essentially just means that the airstream causes the active articulator to strike the passive articulator repeatedly, some number of times. So the classic example is the rhotic trill, as it occurs, for instance, in a number of Romance languages like Spanish and Italian. And the feature tap indicates something similar to trills, but only just a single strike against the passive articulator. So if we create a word like ara, there the tongue has just struck against the passive articulator 1 time. In the charts, implosive stops are not indicated. The feature implosive is not referred to here, but for languages with a distinction between implosive and explosive sounds, we can use that feature to obtain that distinction, say for where that distinction is relevant in some African languages or languages of Southeast Asia. I've already mentioned the feature long above with respect to vowels, but it can also be used to indicate geminate consonants, for instance, in languages like Italian that have a distinction between long and short consonants. I'll usually use the International Phonetic Alphabet sign that of these 2 points. Let me zoom in briefly so you can see exactly what that looks like. This is different. Remember that this is different from a colon when you're trying to indicate length in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Okay, one small homework assignment, which I would encourage you to do before the following lecture, is to download a piece of software. This is a piece of software written by your textbook author called Features. And I'm going to talk about how to use this program called Features at the beginning of the 4th lecture. So thanks everyone for your attention today, and I'll see you in the exercise session on Wednesday. Bye.